Okay, so look, a little bit of a weird thing. I don't think we have a soul, and that's okay. The soul is a weird idea. Honestly, okay, backing up, I think about topics in philosophy, religion, and just other general beliefs that the zeitgeist, that culture holds to be true. I think we need to gain the ability nowadays to be able to step back and say that's actually a weird thing, right? Like it's just so normal that we're swimming around within this culture, and we have all these sorts of belief systems, and we have all these sorts of things we hold true, and they seem normal because we've been with it for so long. But we just need to be able to step back and say, actually, that's weird. The soul, I think, commonly understood in like the religious sense, and understood outside of religion, but commonly understood in the religious sense, especially for Americans, the soul is a weird thing. It kind of, when I think of where it came from, like the modern day view of the soul, the modern religious view of the soul, I think of Aquinas. And the soul is basically the animating principle of the body, to where it moves. It's like at the core of what is our essence, and it's also at the core of what directs the entire human self, right? Importantly, the soul is our essence too. We are essentially at the core, that is what we are. We are the soul, right? And in biblical narratives, when you die, at least that's what I was taught, in a Tennessean upbringing in evangelicalism. I was taught that when you die, your soul is what rises up into the afterlife, right? Because that's what's most essentially you. There's just not a lot of evidence for something like the soul. We obviously are animated creatures, right? We are guided by some moving power. Scientists think of that as like the motion of life, right? And the biggest gripe I have with the idea of the soul is that it's like unified, at least in the way that Aquinas through the modern day has given us. The soul is said to be wholly one in a sort of way. And there's just not a lot of evidence that what we most essentially are and what animates us, either of those things don't seem to be unified. There seems to be at the core, it seems to be a sort of plurality, right? What do I mean by this? There's this really cool guy named William James in the early 1900s, late 1800s, psychologist, philosopher. He was putting up big numbers when psychology wasn't really a science yet. And so he was kind of doing both psychology and philosophy. Anyway, he was also skeptical of the idea that the mind or the soul is like one wholly unified substance. He didn't say it was wholly chaotic and fragmented. He actually argued against that, but he was like railed against the idea that the soul was a wholly absolute unified substance, as he perceived people like Hegel to believe. James's alternative, and again, it's hard to pin down James on what he actually believes himself, seems to be something like the self and the mind is a plural thing, to where we include a set of eaches, and our selfhood, who we are, is distributed among the eaches, like from the phrase each and every, distributed among the eaches of ourself, right? And what our self is sort of like a loose agreement between those eaches. I read about this in my college thesis, so I won't go too far into that, but basically, James highlights how a more unified person, not wholly unified, but a more unified person is more psychologically healthy, and a less unified person with less togetherness tends to be psychologically unhealthy, right? All that said, James does not like the idea of the soul, and I think he offers a pretty plausible argument that kind of gets at the heart at what I think we intuitively interact with when we're interacting with people and we're thinking about how their mental health is, or what psychologists are thinking about, or what other folks in mental health are thinking about. They don't tend to think that the person is fully peaceful within themselves if they're having some sort of psychological trouble or disturbance. There's like a sort of internal battle going on here. And that makes me step back and think, yeah, this idea of the soul doesn't exactly seem super plausible. Another thing, again, I'm not going to go super in depth with this because I'm way out of my field here, but the CAPS model is a psychological model, which, if I remember correctly, it also highlights the distributed nature of the psychological phenomenon that directs us to. Long story short, the guy who did the marshmallow experiment, whether or not kids will eat the marshmallow if left alone, yada, 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 he also helped develop a psychological model that basically said the same thing, that the self is not exactly welded together in an Thomas Aquinas style, current evangelical style soul that we think. The mind has togetherness and it directs it. It has a direction, but it's not cut and clear, welded into one substance. But is this okay? There's a practical outcome of the soul not being a reality, because that seems to be disturbing, because I'm just a random ass dude and I'm saying, yeah, the soul doesn't exist. Now we are left with a practical problem. Well, what do we do about that? I'm like, what I think is that it's okay. It's okay that the soul doesn't exist. And the reason why I think it's okay is because we're not tied down to an essential self. And the reason I word it that way is because I think there's a lot of people who often it reflects experiences or choices that they made in the past. And then, like, let's take, for example, somebody makes a really bad choice in their teens, or whatever, and they grow up into an adult and they feel like they are essentially that bad person because they did that thing and then that marked them to be a bad person indefinitely. Right? I think the idea of the soul is kind of at work behind the scenes there. And if we step away from the idea of the soul as a culture in general, then I suspect that problems like that will happen less often, because there's no essential unchanging person. I know, like, the example that I gave was probably not a very good example, because I just said the soul is unchanging and then I said, well, that experience changed them. But what is at the core here is that there's a very static, stable essence within you that the idea of the soul makes us want to believe. And that if we drop the idea of the soul, I think we'll think of ourselves as more malleable, and we'll think of ourselves as an open book, like a story that's not been fully written yet. And so drop the idea of the soul and remind yourself that you're an open book and you're not totally tied to the past. And you're an active creation, and the pen is in your hand. I think that's a good thing. And I think going into the future, we need to be more individualistic. Well, okay, pause. We don't need to be more individualistic. We need to be individuals. We need to be able to be ourselves on our own 2 feet. And if we are individuals going into 2026, then we resist the harmful collectivism where everybody gets riled up about hot topic issues. We can be ourselves and we can think for ourselves, and I think that's a good thing. Again, long, crazy rant, but I'm passionate about that.